As you can see, the title of our session this morning is on Noospheric consciousness. And when we were talking about the conference and preparing for all of the sessions and reviewing the program, and it becomes clear just the sheer breadth of topics that are covered by the Noosphere heading. Everything from science and technology, philosophy, global affairs, politics, theology, spirituality, education, dissemination, creative expression. And the question for me, and I think for many of us here within Human Energy and also at the conference, is how do we begin to tie some of these themes together? And will we have some space in the conference to do so? And that's part of what was really hoping to do this morning, is to have some time to think about how some of these themes connect. Okay, so now for me, just to give a little bit of this introduction, the emphasis is going to sort of be on the language. How are we talking about these questions? How are we talking about the science? How are we talking about the philosophy and the humanities and the religious perspective? What is the language that we use? You can see my influence is going to be neuroscience, music, and mysticism, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by all that. A few goals. The definitions actually, we probably won't need to spend too much time on. Consciousness and collective consciousness have been really discussed extensively here at the conference, but I'll make a few points. And then the concept of noospheric consciousness. What might that even possibly mean? And that we'll get to when we get to the panel conversation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about neurobiology and the neurobiology of consciousness as really a case study in transdisciplinarity. And I would just like to leave you with perhaps three ideas. One is that neurons are a bit like people. Two, that brain communication is actually a bit like music. And that lastly, well, we've been drawing this analogy between neurons and people. And, well, I'm pretty sure we all know people are more than neurons, but I kind of want to drive that point home too as well. And then we'll get to the discussion. So, of course, consciousness is this mammoth topic, and as I alluded to, I'm not really going to really touch it in much depth, and in large part because we've talked about it, and also because, gosh, just look at all the terms we use to describe consciousness, and are we on the same page? Are we talking about the same thing when we say something like sentience, mindfulness, mind, experience, intelligence? There's already shown that we've had a lot of difficulty just trying to define those terms. And so I just decided to I figured I'd just quickly share what's in the dictionary if you were to look up consciousness, because I think that might be where us non-academic specialists might begin, right? So these are the three definitions according to the Oxford Dictionary. The state of being number one. There's actually 7 entries or 8 entries, I think, but I just put the first 3. The state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, what I refer to as the state or level of consciousness. 2, the awareness or perception of something by a person, what I'm referring to as the content of consciousness. And 3, the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world, what we might sort of describe as consciousness in itself. And what I think a lot of the philosophers here at the conference and more broadly have pointed to is that these definitions leave out the phenomenal consciousness to a certain degree, and Francis mentioned this. And this is a famous article by Thomas Nagel, asked the question, what is it like to be a bat? There must be something that it is like to be a bat, pointing to the fact that experience, consciousness feels like something. And so this is where I was going to just briefly touch on the hard problem, and I don't have to, because Lawrence Kuhn, in his sweeping presentation, went through the wide range of philosophical ideas about the hard problem of consciousness. That is, how do we relate our experience, phenomenal experience, back to these bodies, these seemingly material world that we live in. And you can see we covered the landscape here. And this presentation reminded me of this piece that I had read, quote that is, even though that which is usually called mind is widely esteemed and much discussed, since it is not understood correctly just as it is in itself, there come into existence inconceivable numbers of philosophical ideas and assertions. So where did I pull this from? This is actually from an Indian Buddhist, Padmasambhava, thought to live around sometime in the 8th century. And I just thought there was something really uncanny about this quote, that we've probably been struggling with this for a very long time, right? That there's this whole wide range of ideas, but also pointing to the fact that we all have immediate experience of consciousness. We all know what it means, what it's like, what it feels like to be conscious. And so on some level, I think that's what we're wrestling with in this question of noospheric consciousness and for human energy, is to start to talk about this in a way that will also make sense to those of us, for everybody and non-academic specialists, that they have they have an experience of it. They shouldn't necessarily need to pull out a philosophy book to come to an understanding of what it means to be a part of the noosphere. Okay. And so, of course, this is where most conversations about consciousness usually take us, which is that the brain is somehow involved in this. And so I'm a neurobiologist, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And there are, of course, a myriad of neural theories about how consciousness works. And I'm not going to address any of these in particular, but just to, again, just show the sheer breadth of ideas and thinking around this topic. What I'd like to focus on instead is a slightly different problem from the hard problem, and one that I think I would hope points us back to a more interdisciplinary, potentially transdisciplinary conversation. And that is the relationship between the sciences and the humanities, the relationships between sometimes what we call objective and subjective concepts, particularly things like meaning, beauty, value, and truth. How do we relate that? That's going to be a part of any understanding of noospheric consciousness. So how do we relate that to the neuroscience or the science of consciousness? And those very concepts, meaning, value, beauty, that's exactly where many of the sociological definitions of collective consciousness really pick up. So this is just from Wikipedia. Collective consciousness is the set of shared beliefs, ideas, moral attitudes, which operate as a unifying force within society. And I'm just referring to this as the sociological definition based on the work of Emil Durkheim, famous sociologist, basically founded the field. And I just wanted to point out, as I was just reading a little bit about Durkheim, I found this quote from him that struck me as very noospheric, as we found many people have been raising the point before Teilhard, but I like this quote: "By aggregating and interpenetrating and fusing together, individual souls give birth to a being, psychic if one wishes, but which constitutes a psychic individuality of a new kind," really, in some sense, pointing to a subjective experience almost at a collective level. And many of these ideas, I'm not a sociologist, but I understand, were largely discredited and panned throughout most of the 20th century. But I think some of this particular idea is coming back. Okay, so like I said, we're going to talk about noospheric consciousness when we get to the panel and group discussion. And in the meantime, I wanted us to start to think a little bit more back about the relationship between the brain and a more what I might call humanities-oriented view of how the brain works. So this is a case study in transdisciplinarity. So this is an artist's rendition of a brain cells. These creatures here on the right in blue and white are neurons. What you can see off on the side here is a blood vessel with some red blood cells moving through it. And here in yellow is the astrocyte cells that are connecting the neurons to their blood flow and their blood supply. And I wanted to just offer the perspective that neurons are a lot like people. So we've been talking at this conference quite a bit about information, computation, and neurons are really nothing like a traditional microcircuit. So they need food. For them, it's a matter of life and death. They can live, they can die. They're highly socially connected, and of course, they have a lot to say. They're constantly generating activity. And even more complicated is the fact that sometimes they change their opinions. Sometimes they like some things, and then the next day, the next minute, they have a totally different perspective. And so this is, I think, points to something really distinct and different between the way a brain works and the way our computer works. And so, but it's that point about communication. What are neurons talking about? What are they saying that we typically relate to and think about and study when we talk about consciousness? And so I think perhaps most of you know that brains work through electrical communication. So I just wanted to give play a short video showing you how all that electrical activity is coordinated. And this is from the Blue Brain Project, which I believe now is at UCLA, where they're attempting to simulate, this is actually a simulation of neural activity over just a 100 millisecond period. And what's shown in color will be the change in the membrane potential of the neurons. And so you can see some twinkling lights, and then this wave of depolarization is going to come in. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. You guys getting that? Okay. So just kind of like, being at that baseball stadium, right? Put up your arms and send the wave around. And when we take those waves and measure them from the scalp, we see that there's these rhythms of electrical activity. And this is what's called an electroencephalogram, or EEG. And so one of the questions, if we were to look at this, right, and we're interested in how the brain works, just want to know, or we're interested in consciousness, you'd say, okay, well, there's some rhythms. Let's call up an engineer, maybe an electrical engineer, and we'll measure the power in each of these frequency bands, and we'll see that we have a whole family of rhythms here, and that, when you do that, you can see that different frequency bands have a different power, total power, and maybe there's this little bump near the top that's right around 10 hertz. That happens to be the alpha rhythm. So we can interpret this and say, well, this is a brain that's just kind of idling at rest. Well, so that's one possible interpretation. But imagine there was a composer who overheard the conversation and would say, well, yeah, family of rhythms, sounds like maybe you have a musical performance going on, and might have a totally different perspective on what the meaning of those rhythms might be. Of course, if you were to ask the composer, well, so what's the meaning of the music of your symphony? Say, well, I don't know. What's the meaning of a piece of art? What's the meaning of that? It's kind of a difficult question, right? And I'm not an expert in music nor philosophy, but I did consult one of my favorite philosophers in this domain, Suzanne Langer, who's written extensively on really trying to understand the meaning of music. And what she says is that, well, music has no literal meaning. It may present emotive experience through global forms that are indivisible. So what does she mean by that? Well, she goes on to say that works of art are images of the forms of feeling. Their expressiveness can rise to the presentation of all aspects of mind. And for Langer, feeling was anything that could be felt, from the subtlest of sensations to the most consuming aspects of our emotional experience, including our thoughts. And so for her, feeling and form, which was the title of actually one of her books, was that feeling and form was actually what consciousness was all about. So this is perhaps nice poetry, but is there any relevance to this in terms of how we might study the brain? And I think part of the message that Langer is suggesting to us is that not only is meaning felt, but it's a multi-layered dynamic whole. And if you were a neuroscientist, as most neuroscientists have done for the past 40 years, if they were to study something like music, well, they would kind of break it up. They would, okay, well, we'll play back a particular note. We'll see how the brain responds to that particular note and try to understand how all of that gets combined. But instead, what Yuri Hassan and some colleagues over at Princeton did was they decided to take a very different approach to how the brain responds to music. And rather than just looking merely at the activity of the brain, what they measured was how correlated two people's experiences of listening to the same piece of music was. And so, but more than that, where he started was actually first to just scramble all the measures up. So where the yellow lines are, just scramble the measures and then play that back. So this is just a schematic. I'm going to just grossly simplify the results of their experiment. And when you just scramble the measures and play it back, this is the amount of area that was correlated between participants. So this is not the amount of brain that was active. The whole brain was active, but this is just the area that was correlated between people. And then he scrambled the phases, the phrases within the music, so which was denoted where these green bars are. And you can see that starts to pull in a wider range of correlated brain activity. And then he played the whole piece back. And of course, you could see that pulls out an even wider breadth of the brain, was showing this correlation, sort of a dynamical correlation between participants, not necessarily saying they're interpreting it the same way or experiencing it the same way, but something about the form of the piece of music had made its way throughout the brain, and that the dynamics of that brain activity were similar from person to person. So you might say, okay, that's kind of a neat trick, but it's really specific to music or something like that. So the colleagues actually did the same experiment and just switched it up and gave people, played back the beginning of a book or a piece of text. And again, when they scrambled the words, it was a small area of the brain was correlated, scrambled into sentences, and it was greater. But when you play the whole piece back, the whole work, the whole story, it was a wider swath of the brain that was collectively active. So what can we learn from these findings? Well, the first thing that I think it tells us is that how we infer meaning from music and stories might be shared in some way. Again, not emphasizing that the meaning is exactly we come to the same interpretation, but the process of meaning making is similar. And that might be perhaps what's going on in the brain, is the process of meaning making. So there's this shared meaning, but how does that get us back to Langer's idea of global forms and potentially even feeling? And here I'm going to show one more slide. This is the sort of last neuroscience-y technical slide of the day, so hopefully you can follow along with this. This is from the work here of, I'm sorry, I missed, came off. There we go. This is from the work of Michael Breakspear and his colleague Shine. And what he did was first to look at the dynamics of brain activity, not during a single task, but while participants were doing a whole range of things: mathematics, emotional expression, gambling, reading. In fact, they did about 8 or 9 different tasks from the Human Connectome project. They had more than 200 people. And rather than looking for necessarily correlations between people, now they were just looking for correlations in that activity within the same person, but across all of these different sorts of mental activities, looking for these patterns. And this is what they did was they projected the dynamics in a higher dimensional space. They were trying to see if there's some higher order regularities or patterns in the brain activity. And what they found was that, yes, on average, there was this sort of dynamical form that was present across all kinds of different tasks, whether they were sort of sitting there idly or whether they were engaged in some deep cognition. And to me, this was really striking, right? That no matter what you do, there's some underlying dynamic in the brain that is shared and from which many of the other more complicated processes emerge. And again, this idea that there might really be something kind of like what Suzanne Langer was talking about, that there are these global forms shared across the domains of mental experience. And so in some of my own work, in collaboration with Parham Portavood, who will be talking later this afternoon, we've begun to look at these global forms to really see, are they related to emotional experience in some way? And in just some of our very initial work here, what we're seeing is some of these global forms are related to basic arousal processes and the sort of alertness, but also the awareness that one has as they're coming to be present in the environment, right? So we think of arousal as sort of being, well, you're either awake or you're asleep, but there's sort of varied, graded states of arousal, and emotional experience is largely captured in that. When we're more emotionally engaged and active, we have greater arousal. And the other part to what we've been seeing in some of our studies is to see that those global forms are present throughout the different frequency ranges in the brain. So we've been attempting to really sort of create a marriage of the engineering and artistic approach here by looking across these different frequency ranges, and we see that actually some of the more high frequency activity shows a related global pattern that has more differentiation in it, and that is correlated with more thought content, greater thinking while one is just resting. And so I won't have too much more to say about this particular topic, but I just want to point out for those of you who are interested, our hypothesis with all this work is that these aspects of the dynamics of these global forms really depend on what I was alluding to at the beginning of my talk, depends on the human-like qualities of neurons. The fact that it's really a matter of life and death, not only for the neuron, but for the whole organism. And that's what drives some of these arousal processes. That neurons are incessantly active. They need a large supply of energy to continue to function. And again, these are the things that make them so different from what we typically think of our computers, although we frequently draw that analogy. So I'll leave you with this point here with respect to the neurobiology of music, that we hear a lot that, well, maybe the brain is just tuned to music. That's what it's all about. And I think that's probably true, but also that I'd like to suggest that the activity of the brain itself is like a kind of music. It's not exactly music, but it's something kind of like that. Now we have to make this link between the individual and the collective. And while neurons clearly participate in the music of the brain, what I would suggest is that, well, only humans participate in the music of the spheres. And I want to thank Boris Shoshitashvili, one of my collaborators. And for those of you who missed this discussion about the music of the spheres, the harmonization across biosphere, noosphere, I would really recommend that. And but what am I pointing to here? I'm pointing to the sort of the dramatic difference, right, between electrical communication in a brain and cultural communication as human beings. Clearly, electrical communication was a dramatic advance. It's not necessarily thought of as one of a canonical major evolutionary transition, but it's what enabled multicellularity to communicate at these rapid speeds. Cultural communication is an entirely different process, an entirely different being. And so we have to be careful about the analogies we draw. And towards that end, what I'll point out is that, of course, a neuron may only have the vaguest instinct that it is embedded in a larger whole, but we all know that we are embedded in a larger whole. What humanity and what is often referred to as metaconsciousness. It's not merely that we have consciousness or experience consciousness. We have reflective consciousness. We have metaconsciousness. We know that we know. And I think this is where it brings us into terrain that, frankly, the religious traditions and mystical traditions provide a lot of insight. And with respect to religion and mysticism, it's pointing towards an experience of something greater than oneself, perhaps a transcendental experience, but also just how we make meaning is clearly more than just our individual selves. And on the one hand, I think that this points to a sort of more traditional or even etymological definition of religion based on religare, that's which binds us either to a tradition or perhaps to each other. It also points to this other perspective that I think mystics and scientists share, which is that they're seeing into the unknown, they're seeing into a whole, but we can only see partially into that whole. And what I'll leave you with a new concept. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of negative capability. Initially a concept from the poet Keats, was later adopted by many psychoanalysts. Negative capability is the capacity to rest in mysteries, doubt, without reaching irritably after fact or reason. So just a very different way of working with knowledge and with being an experience, resting in the mystery. And I think if we can bring that humility to our conversation, I think it will take us a long way.